The demonstrators targeted the site of a proposed police and fire training center that they've dubbed Cop City.
It's a fight over policing that's made national headlines.
Stop Cop City! Stop Cop City!
You know, there are all these conversations about, are the police too militarized? Did the police use excessive force?
A debate that's turned deadly.
I never thought that Manuel could die.
But what is this so-called Cop City, and why is it sparking such a reaction? We're digging past the headlines to the issues this police training center is raising, because the issues happening here are happening across the country.
People nationally are looking at it a very, cops versus protesters. I think here it's a lot more layered than that.
So we spoke with activists, environmentalists, law enforcement experts, journalists, and more to find a deeper understanding of the issues surrounding the environment, social justice, and government transparency that this center raises, leading many to say places like this should not exist at all. Yet there are supporters who say these training centers are necessary. The Atlanta Public Safety Training Center, also known as Cop City, was publicly announced in 2021. Partially, the city says, to improve old, dilapidated training facilities in Atlanta for police, but also largely in the wake of calls for police reform after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Rayshard Brooks here in Atlanta died at the hands of police. The city says the world-class facility will help train the next generation of law enforcement to be better prepared for emergencies. It's a proposed 85-acre development in more than 300 acres of forest south of downtown Atlanta. The land was once Native American land and then was a prison farm from the 1920s until 1995. Right now, it's city land, and the city says it plans to use a piece of land already cleared of trees to build a complex, including a mock city to practice emergency situations, a shooting range, burn buildings for fire training, and other public safety resources. Dozens of acres are also set aside for trails and green space. The center is expected to cost at least $90 million, with taxpayers footing at least $31 million. The rest of the money will come from the Atlanta Police Foundation and other private entities. This training center would be one of the largest and most advanced in the country, joining large-scale police training centers already open in New York, Texas, Illinois, and Washington State. 43% of trainees that would be coming here to Atlanta are expected to come from departments outside the state.
You want to provide as much reality as you can to that trainee.
Alex Del Carmen and Keith Taylor have dedicated their careers to studying law enforcement training. They're not affiliated with the Atlanta Training Center, but they support more training for police. Del Carmen says public concern over a police training center is valid because of what these centers have been used for in the past.
They're not designed typically to engage in community reform, assessments or community engagement groups. So to that end, the community is right in feeling that, this sort of further expands the military aspect or the paramilitary aspect of policing. While on the other hand, I would argue that it also helps them understand, what police officers go through.
But Keith Taylor argues this center could be a place for a different kind of police training if the public is allowed input in what happens at the center.
It's important that it's not given lip service and that it's actually reflected in what is developed in future plans.
Taylor says this would be a vital resource to improve training, especially for smaller law enforcement agencies that travel to train there.
Especially the training, the classroom training, things like bias, understanding bias, and cultural competencies. Those are really important.
But even with the potential for positive training, the public is deeply divided. In a recent Emory University poll, 48% of Atlanta residents support the training center, while nearly 46% oppose it. 6% aren't sure. And it gets more complicated because among those opposed to the center, opinions still differ on why. There are advocates like Kamal Franklin. He founded nonprofit Community Movement Builders and lives in Atlanta. He says this training center shouldn't be built, period.
We are opposed to it no matter where it is.
Franklin is worried there is no such thing as better training for police.
I think it's a false argument and a false narrative that they're building. The cop here in Atlanta that killed Rayshard Brooks by shooting him in the back had over 2,000 hours of training. He had cultural sensitivity training. He had de-escalation training. And so the issue is not the training. The issue is the institution itself.
But he says there are solutions that he would like to see in his neighborhood and across the country.
People in the community need to have the power to hire, fire, and discipline police officers.
On top of the policing and social justice concerns are the environmental concerns.
And all this green space is referred to as one of Atlanta's lungs.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see, right?
Groups like Jackie Eccles' South River Watershed Alliance say this center would dump sediment into the river, obstructing river life, and it would destroy precious green space in a community of mostly families of color who historically have had less access to places like this.
The whole purpose of government is to look out for the least of its citizens. This should not be happening here. The only reason it's happening here is because of the color of the community, and that's what's called environmental racism.
Among the environmental groups who are opposed to the center is a group of anti-government demonstrators. They were actually living here, occupying the forest, and this is what you probably saw making headlines. Back in January, police tried to remove the demonstrators from this site to clear it for construction when one demonstrator, 26-year-old Manuel Paez-Terán, was killed.
There's so many questions that are unanswered.
Officials say police officers did not have their body cameras turned on the day Paez-Terán was shot. But there were multiple clashes between police and this group. Now, many of those protesters are facing domestic terrorism charges.
Labeling protesters as domestic terrorists without a single act of violence against a person that preceded any of this is really terrifying, and everyone across the country should be paying attention to what's happening here.
The investigation into Manuel Paez-Terán's death is sealed as it continues, but their family says there needs to be more police accountability so the public can know what really happened. And police accountability and transparency is another big concern for journalists and activists alike, with the center being both publicly and privately funded.
For the first time in the history of the country, a private organization is going to be in charge of training a municipal police force. We don't think that's a good idea.
No element of this should be private. Like, if we're talking about a police agency with guns who can shoot people, like, I want accountability for that.
These concerns of racial profiling, police militarization, environmental pollution and racism, and government transparency are all swirling around Atlanta. But those we spoke with agree what's happening here is a snapshot of a national experience.
It's incredibly important to have this big philosophical argument about what policing should look like and how you bake it into, like, training. Because it's not just Atlanta training, it's everybody.
If it can happen here in Atlanta, in this space, in 2023, it can happen anywhere.
The training center is still in its pre-construction phase as funding is being worked out. Many are working to make sure the site never opens, but if it does, there's hope that because the community won't stand silent here, the future of policing could look different than it has in the past.
We believe that we as the people, we really have the power.
I'm still hopeful about this.
Everybody alive wants to live in a safe community. I know I sure do. That said, I do think that there's a lot of nuance to how we accomplish that.
And we reached out to the City of Atlanta, the Atlanta Police Department, and the Atlanta Police Foundation asking for interviews to discuss the center, how it would work, how it would be funded, and how transparent it would be. None of the agencies agreed to an interview.